Andrew took Silk, age 41, works in the area of insurance law. And Andrew, I think this is a little known fact, and you would never tell us this, but Andrew went up to Cambridge age 17 and passed out at Cambridge top of his year, age 19. So I'm feeling really rather nervous sitting here, although something may have happened in the last few years, but I'm a little nervous at this interview.
I don't like to say I passed out at Cambridge.
Okay. Andrew, just explain to us for a moment, what is a King's Counsel?
It just means I'm a senior barrister, so I represent clients in court and I advise on difficult questions of law, which isn't as hard as it sounds. The harder the question, the easier it is to say, it's very difficult, it's very uncertain, it all depends. You have to practice the expression with which you say it to your clients, but that's basically what it's about.
Well, you've given away a bit of a secret there. Now, have you always been interested in the law and in law?
I first started to look into the law when I was in my early teens. But then when I was 15, I had the chance to go and spend a couple of days with a barrister who was a friend of my parents in his chambers. And I think that's where my interest really started.
And was there anything particular when you were there that kind of gripped your attention?
Well, I vividly remember the one case he was working on for the first of the days I was with him. He was acting for a British company who made a particular type of speedboat. And this was basically a modern form of landing craft. So it had a ramp at the front, and it was designed to deliver people onto a beach at high speed. And it had machine gun mountings front and back, and it was called a fast assault craft. And this company had a contract to sell, I think, about 15 of these ships to the admiral who was in charge of the Iranian Navy. And this was in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war. And the British authorities had placed an export ban, so the contract wasn't going ahead. And my friend's job was to try and persuade the British authorities to lift the ban. And the argument was, on instructions from the client, that this Iranian naval officer had a very large family. He had quite a number of wives and a lot of children, and they all liked going off for days at the beach. And so he needed these landing craft in order to be able to deliver his family onto the beach. And I thought it was really, quite cool at that age to be arguing that with the British government as a barrister.
And did they win?
No.
No. Now, you might just turn a little bit more square so that the people round to your right get a chance to see your facial expression when things get serious. Andrew, just, in a few words, what makes a good barrister?
I'm not sure I know. I think someone who takes an interest in the law, who thinks very carefully about the basic concepts, who has some attention to detail, and is willing to work quite hard.
And you also work as a part-time judge in the Southwark Crown Criminal Court.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, I know because we've chatted over many years, you've had one or two very interesting cases. What's the most kind of gripping case you've been involved in?
So I've done this for about 11 years. I only do about a month a year jury trials in the criminal court, mostly over at Southwark. When I was sitting there about, I think, 6 years ago, I had a case sprung on me in which the defendant, having just been released from prison the night before, had picked up a razor blade in the street. She'd gone up behind a girlfriend and boyfriend, and she slashed the girlfriend behind the back of the knee, deep slash right down to the bone, basically yelling as she did it, "I want to go back to prison." But she didn't stop there. The victim retreated into Burger King with her boyfriend, and the defendant followed them in and started a really frenzied and sustained attack on the victim with the razor blade, slashing her about the head and neck, permanent scarring, that sort of thing. And of course, there was CCTV footage in the Burger King, so we got to watch it in all its glory. I reminded myself of some of what happened this afternoon by going to that well-known online repository of truth called the Mail Online, which carried a couple of reports of what happened during that case. But that was certainly one of the most dramatic and most serious that I've done. I mean, it was, a few inches away from being murder.
Mm-hmm. It must be. I mean, how do you find when you're in a case like that? You head off home and there you are with the family and so forth. How do you make that sort of adjustment?
I don't find that too difficult. I think the family is quite helpful. Sometimes when you're sitting in court, you realise that you have quite a lot of power over some of the people in the room. But then when you go home and you ask your children to put the dishes in the dishwasher, you realise that you have no power at all.
And thank you for that. Your work in insurance is obviously of a very different nature. What can you tell us, because you're involved in a very big insurance case at the moment, just tell us what you can in a moment or two about what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, so I've always done quite a lot of what's called political risk, political violence insurance. A lot of our work over the last 18 months has been Russia-Ukraine related. The big case that most of us are working on at the moment concerns aircraft that are operated by Russian airlines that should have been returned to the owners in the West when sanctions were imposed in February 2022, but they're still in Russia, they're still being flown, they haven't come back. So the Western owners are bringing insurance claims for the total loss of their aircraft. And the case I'm involved in is looking at the claim in respect of 155 Boeing and Airbus aircraft. So we're talking 747s, A350s, A320s.
And what 100 and how many Boeing aircraft come in at?
Well, the claim is about $4 billion US.
How many lawyers are involved?
Well, the last hearing we had in July, there were about 120 lawyers in court, and there were about 250 lawyers on Zoom who wouldn't fit in court. So yeah, the whole thing is mildly insane.
I know we're all thinking the same thing. Actually, how many billion will be left when we're not going. That's much too grubby. Now, Andrew, let's get to where we're at tonight. So we're on this issue: is it ignorant to claim the truth? I mean, you're dealing in this kind of currency all the time. What do you think are the key criteria to discover truth?
The key way we go about discovering truth in the law is what we call evidence. And evidence is both what documents show and what witnesses say. And so you look at the whole spectrum of the available evidence to discover what's reliable and what's not reliable. And in a sense, even in court, even as a judge, you're deciding whose testimony you can believe, whose testimony is reliable in reaching a conclusion in the case in front of you.
Mm. And I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit more, because when it comes to testimony, how do you weigh testimony in court?
Well, you start by looking at whether it is consistent with other testimony, consistent with events that are likely to have taken place, consistent often with CCTV footage or that sort of thing. And you look at the credibility of the person who's giving evidence. So if the person, for example, has a string of convictions for dishonesty, that might be relevant in deciding what weights you place on their testimony. If they're saying that they weren't dealing drugs when actually they've got 4 previous convictions for dealing drugs, that might weigh in the balance. But it's not generally just one piece of evidence from one person. You're looking at the whole spectrum of all the available information.
Thank you very much. Does truth matter? You come across a lot of people who seem, I would say, occasional people who, well, truth, your truth, my truth. Does truth really matter? And if so, why?
I think in the real world, truth does matter, because day to day we all rely, and we all need to be able to rely on what other people say to us. So, for example, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says something to you by way of a diagnosis, you'd probably be unwise to say, well, that's your truth and I've got my truth, and I'm going to live my way. I just don't think that's how most people go about living their lives if they're honest about it. I think also words and truth matter because they are of the essence of relationship. I think we're only capable of having relationships if we're able to rely on what people are saying, if their words are sufficiently trustworthy to make a relationship possible. So whilst there are debates, I think at the margins around is it possible to know all truth about everything all of the time, to which I think the answer is no, it doesn't follow from that truth doesn't matter, or that truth is impossible to discern to a sufficient extent for life to be possible.
What would you say to somebody if they were to say to you, there's something of a crisis of truth in our culture? Do you think there's any legs in that sort of statement?
I understand why people say that, but I think in order to say that, you're actually conceding that there is such a thing as truth for there to be a crisis about. If there is no truth, it's not very meaningful to say there's a crisis of truth. So in a sense, to talk about a crisis of truth is quite a hopeful proposition. Often people say that when they are looking to something better than we have at the moment. And I think in looking for something better, people are then recognizing that there needs to be truth for trust and relationship to be possible, and indeed for societies to function.
That's very helpful indeed. Look, let's just push back a bit into your personal life, if we may. You come from a Christian family. Your parents are Christian. Could you talk a little bit about what you might say to somebody who said, well, it's just inherited, you picked up your parents' faith, and really, of course, you're bound to be Christian?
I think there's some truth in saying that it's inherited. I don't duck that. I'm actually very grateful to have inherited from Christian parents an understanding of the truth. But it doesn't follow that it was inevitable that I would believe it. I certainly don't think that everyone brought up in a Christian family ends up believing Christian things. And I think too that after I decided when I was 12 to put my faith in Jesus, I then spent the rest of my teenage years feeling really quite irritated with Christians who couldn't answer my questions about Jesus, feeling really quite uncertain about what it meant, in a sense grappling with doubts. And so I think at the end of that process, which was probably towards the end of my time at university, you wouldn't then be able to say that it was only inherited and was, as it were, an inevitable consequence of the way I'd been brought up.
So in a few words, we've got plenty of time, in fact, so you can, what were the areas that persuaded you that the Christian faith is true, with a capital T?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by true with a capital T. I ultimately, what I found the most helpful in putting to rest my doubts was learning to study the Bible and to see that, in a sense, to look for the answers to my questions from other Christians was almost to look in the wrong place. that actually as you start to grapple with the Bible, you're grappling there with the evidence, you're grappling there with God's disclosure of himself, and you're finding there not just words of truth, but words of relationship. And as it were, through the Bible, you then discover that you're getting to know Jesus better. And that's not just then propositions of truth or statements of truth. It's something more than that. It's words which are true in the sense that they are trustworthy and reliable.
And how did you go about that? I mean, there you are, age 12, and then through to over that period of time, how did you go about that investigation?
Well, I think from age 12 to leaving school, I went about it, as it were, in the wrong way, by looking for help in the wrong places or asking people who didn't know the answers. But then at university, I went to a church where the Bible was taught, and that helped me to see that you go about it by looking at the words on the page. You see what it's saying. Sometimes you have to be willing to live with uncertainty for quite a long time. You might have a question, you might look for an answer, you don't find an answer. But then in due course you do. Either by coming to understand something you didn't understand, or possibly by realizing that you're asking the wrong question.
And if you were advising somebody, for the very first time, where's the best place to start? I mean, where do you sort of dive in? Because the Bible's a huge book.
Well, it isn't a huge book when individual gospels are put in a form like this. I think this is the best place to start, that if you start at the beginning, which with most books is a good place to start, beginning of John, you could read the whole thing in an hour and a half. You could read it a second time and begin to see some of the details you missed the first time, but that's what interrogating the evidence is all about. So I think something like this is the best place to start.
And what persuades you that the kind of eyewitness material in a gospel is actually true?
Well, that's an interesting question. I can apply the normal tools that a lawyer would apply. I can look at whether the evidence is consistent of the different witnesses. I can look at whether it hangs together. But there are some difficulties with that, because the way we would normally do it is to say, well, is this what normally happens in life? We use our common sense experience of the world in the Crown Courts with juries. That's what we ask them to do, to bring their common experience to bear on whether they are sure that something happened. And the quirk with the Bible is that it claims that Jesus and what Jesus came and what Jesus did is unique in the whole of human history. So in a sense, God has, at that point, stacked the deck against himself, because the truth claim involved in something which says it is unique in human history then requires, I think, some rather unique categories and types of evidence to make sense of it. And that's, I think, where the rest of the Bible comes in, because then you're starting with the events and the eyewitness testimony about the events. But then you're moving to the parts of the Bible which actually say, yes, but this is what was promised through all of human history. So it isn't just one set of witnesses at one point in history who might have made it up. It's many people beforehand who didn't live when Jesus came, who were looking forward to the day when this would happen. And as you then see the strands of promise that land in Jesus in what we would call fulfillment, you've actually created what you might call a wholly different category of evidence that I think does then start to support the claim that something unique actually happened in the life of Jesus, and indeed in the death of Jesus.
You may just want to say no to this, but can you think of, because it's so unique, but can you think of anything that is analogous to it that might be anything vaguely similar to it?
Well, I think the answer has to be no, because at the point you're suggesting that it is unique, to concede that there's something analogous is to start to undermine the assertion that it's unique.
Thank you. I feel like I'm being cross-examined for a sudden moment there. Thankfully, there's some strong legs on the chair, even if I haven't got any to stand on at that point. But Andrew, just a couple of final questions, just to speak personally. Husband, father, teenage children, professional man. What makes you glad today that you follow the Lord Jesus?
I think what makes me glad is what Jesus promises the future holds for me if I trust in him. I think we can all look around the world, especially at the moment, and think it's not great. The future is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen next. But actually, Jesus reassures us that he has it under control and that he has a future that he is going to bring about. And I think certainly as I get older, with more years behind me than I had before, that is increasingly reassuring.
And in answer to our question, is it ignorant to claim the truth?
Well, I think it depends who is making what claim to what truth. I think there are many claims to truth that are ignorant and should not be made. And I think you could take a number of examples. So if a jury at the end of a criminal trial, having heard all the evidence, brings back a true verdict according to the evidence, there are very, very many criminal cases in which it is simply not ignorant to say that they have reached a true and right conclusion. I think, changing the example, if you were to go to a doctor and a competent doctor were to make a careful diagnosis of your condition, it wouldn't be ignorant to claim that that diagnosis was true. But of course, in both categories, I do acknowledge that there are cases where people get it wrong. There isn't, as it were, truth to be had in every case all of the time. But that doesn't mean that very often the jury gets to the truth and the doctor gets to the truth. But then change the example again and think about human truth claims about the future. I think that's where human statements start to become unreliable, because we are ignorant of what the future holds. So if I promise my children that I will be home by 9 o'clock tonight, I am assuming and hoping that the train doesn't let me down. But I don't actually know that the train will run, and if it doesn't, I will be late and I will break my promise. And I think this is then where we start to see that Jesus is very different, because the Bible's claim is that everything that Jesus says is true. True about events, true about guilt and justice, like a perfect judge and jury, true in diagnosing our human needs, like a perfect doctor, but then true also in what he promises for the future. And I think that's Jesus' words about the future are trustworthy and reliable in ways human words are not, because Jesus not only knows the future, but he decides what the future will be. And therefore, when Jesus promises something, he has the unfailing ability to be true to his word. And so you start to see that it's not ignorant to claim the truth completely, but there are very real distinctions between human truth claims and God's truth claims. And it probably is ignorant to claim the truth all of the time in every situation if you're human. But the Bible says, not if you're Jesus.
That's very helpful. Now, look, we've all got, I haven't asked you about this question, Andrew, so you may prefer not to, but is there anything, any one particular sentence in this account of the life of Jesus that is particularly, especially precious to you?
Well, 2 points to make about that. You're speaking from Pilate.
I am.
I read through John's Gospel in anticipation of this with my key barrister's implement, which is a yellow highlighter pen. I have lots of them. And I highlighted every time in John's Gospel you come across the word true, truth, or truly. And I counted slightly over 50 occurrences before you get to the chapter that you're speaking on this evening, all about Jesus and his words. That's the first thing to note. But then where I think the gospel comes to a landing, and this is precious, is towards the end in John 20, where John says, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And I think that is important because at the end of the day, the issue here is not whether, like a judge, you're going to form a detached, objective judgment of whether Jesus' words are true and then move on to the next case. The issue here is whether you are going to put your trust in Jesus' words, whether you are going to believe them, whether you are going to have faith in the truth of Jesus' words, and whether you're going to live according to that. So in a sense, the stakes are higher because they are much more personal. And frankly, it takes us into a territory where I think we have to accept that we are biased. We are not, as it were, objective judges who have no skin in the game. What Jesus says claims to be relevant to us, to how we live our life, and in that sense to whether we will accept the truth of what he says and trust in him.
Well, Andrew, thank you very, very much indeed for being willing to answer questions, and it's been really very helpful indeed. Well, there's no doubt here in the city anyway that truth really matters. Just behind us, obviously, is the Lloyd's market, the insurance market. My word is my bond, in utmost good faith. Lose our reputation for integrity, and we lose our reputation. But it's always been the case that truth really matters. Francis Bacon, not the artist, but the Lord Chancellor, 1561 to 1626, his dates, there is no vice that does so cover a person with shame as to be found false and perfidious, deceitful. So there's no doubt that truth really matters, and there is no doubt that we all believe in truth. I think Andrew's helped us to see that clearly. Just a trivial example, and I'm afraid rather an unkind one, but a friend of mine had an acquaintance, a friend at university, and this is a number of years ago, and this friend of his put it out that there is no such thing as truth, and words mean nothing, and your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth. And my friend's friend fell very sick. He had, student flu or something like that. And so my friend, being a kind sort of person, said, well, look, I'll go and do your shopping for you. And so his sick friend gave him a shopping list. And he went off to the shops, and he just walked around the shops and just picked anything he saw first off the shelf and brought it back to his sick friend. That's why I say it's rather an unkind illustration. And when he got back, his friend said, well, hold on a second. I asked you to get this, this, this. And he, oh, well, your words are your words, and my words are my words. And really, that's what it meant to me. So there's no doubt that truth matters, and there's no doubt that we all believe that there is such a thing as truth, and there's no doubt that there are different kinds of truth. Medical, the results have come in. Relational, I love you. Judicial, I find the defendant. Financial, I promise to pay the bearer. And so forth. Is it ignorant to claim the truth? Well, it depends what kind of truth we're talking about, and it depends who it is making the claim. And for the next few minutes, what I would like to do is to take a look at just one incident in this eyewitness account. Now, you'll find a copy of John's eyewitness account. John was Jesus' closest disciple. He was trained by Jesus and commissioned by Jesus to provide us with a reliable account of the life of Jesus. And for the sake of transparency, just turn to page 60, right up front, as it were. And this is the sentence that Andrew alluded to, that we know what John's purpose is in writing this. It's there at the top of the page, purpose of the book, page 60. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So that's what John's aim is, just so that we're aware what he's doing. Well, I just want to draw our attention to two quite simple points. The first is that Jesus has revealed truth from beyond. That's the kind of truth we're dealing with. And you can see immediately in the context of this trial that is what Jesus is claiming of himself. Page 53, where we started, the bottom of the page there, verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from this world." A friend of mine wrote a book on John's account, on John's gospel, and he called the book "The Man from Outside." It's a great title, isn't it? That is, Jesus came to testify to truth about which without him, you and I can have no understanding. So where we came from, why we're here, what lies beyond, where we're going, what we are to make of life, and what constitutes a worthwhile goal in life. And actually that claim to have come from outside is embedded also in the sentence that I want us to look at most closely this evening, and that is number 37, just over the page on page 54. Pilate said to Jesus, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered him, "You say that I am a king." And now here is the sentence, "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And then explains why truth in this whole account plays, as Andrew mentioned, such a significant part. Let me just draw our attention to a very few sentences. First, direct claims, and then indirect. Direct. There, right in the opening, chapter 1, verse 14, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." And then in chapter 8, Jesus says this, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And then in chapter 14, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also." So peppered through this account are these very, very direct claims on the part of Jesus to be able to speak the truth to us, the man from outside. And then there are the indirect claims. Here are just a couple. "Truly, truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know and bear witness to what we have seen. No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man." And there is Jesus. "I have come down from above. I speak of what I know and have seen above, and I'm declaring it to you now." And another indirect claim, "I have much to say about you and much to judge, but he who sent me is true, and I declare to the world what I have heard from him." So here's the point. Jesus declares to us truth from beyond. You and I live within, inevitably, the closed system, if you like, the cage, as Max Weber put it, of this world. of this universe. I mean, how much can we know of all that there is to know, even within the universe? Probably 0.01% if you're feeling particularly bright. But Jesus has broken in as the man from outside. He says this, no one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, this is referring to himself, is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Jesus even says this, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And so I guess the question that we're asking one another to consider is, do Jesus' claims match up? Does the life of this man bear up to the claims of this man? And John and all the other eyewitnesses would say it really does. And not only are there the miracles, there's also his life, and then his teaching, and supremely his death and resurrection, all of which, as Andrew so helpfully put, the matrix, the tapestry, if you like, of the whole Bible story points towards. So he's not just a kind of a bolt from the blue. He fits into the whole explanatory grid and the matrix of the Bible story. Take his miracles, for example. He turns water into wine. He heals the centurion's son on the point of death. He enables the man who's been paralyzed for 38 years to get up and walk immediately. He gives sight to the man born blind. These are all people who everybody had grown up alongside and seen in all their different ailments, and they knew that it was irregular for a man who is born blind to receive their sight, and yet there was their friend Fred who was suddenly able to see. He raises Lazarus from the dead. And that sort of thing didn't happen in the first century. These aren't just gullible peasants. These things did not happen. And Jesus steps in from outside, and there are his miracles. But then there's his life. Alfred Lord Tennyson described the life of Jesus as more beautiful than the greatest of his miracles. And then there's his teaching, which has so obviously shaped the whole of the Western world and all of our values. Tony Jordan, scriptwriter of EastEnders, Echo Beach, and Hustle. Now there's a list. The only thing I know is that the words I hear coming from Jesus are the most truthful words I've ever read. And if Tony Jordan doesn't carry much sort of weight for you, Tom Holland, the historian, when asked why he believes Jesus is a historical figure, he says, well, he's teaching. And then there's his death and resurrection. And John and these eyewitnesses, they staked their life on it. There's a guy called Chuck Coulson. He was part of the Nixon group in the whole Watergate affair. And Chuck Coulson has spoken here in this building on a number of occasions over the years. And he says, on the eve of Watergate, when it was just being discovered, they all got together and decided the story that they were going to stick to. And by the next morning, the first person had broken cover. But the early disciples, they stuck to the story and went to their death. Even Jesus' own siblings, his half-brothers, came to believe that he was who he said he was, none other than God himself who's broken in from outside. I mean, just think for a moment of one of your siblings. What would it take to convince them and for them to say publicly that you were divine? Quite a lot, I suspect. So there's the first point, and that's why, we would love you to investigate this for yourself, if you haven't done that already, to take one of these Gospels, to read it for yourself. Better still, ask a friend who you've come with, who's invited you to do a kind of guided read-through and read it with you. I love doing that with friends. It's a wonderful way to spend a bit of time, just to meet every now and then and spend half an hour reading through and then enjoy time together. But I think there's something that pushes this a bit further, and that's what Andrew was suggesting. Not only does Jesus reveal truth from beyond, he actually reveals which side we are on. So he reveals truth from beyond, he reveals which side we're on. Let's go back to our key sentence, if we might please, on page 54 now. And you can see it there at the top of the page, where Jesus says, "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" It's actually a gripping account. Take this away. Just read the account of Jesus before Pilate. The choreography is gripping. He goes in, he comes out. Pilate goes in, he comes out to the crowd, he goes in, and it gets more and more intense as you go through. But Pilate ultimately finds himself exposed, and we are shown which side Pilate is on. You have to feel, in one sense, a little sorry for poor old Pilate. You know, he can't have been expecting this when he woke up that morning. The alarm clock went and looked at his diary for the day. And then over toast and marmalade, or perhaps croissant and an espresso, you know, suddenly this case comes up, and he's faced with none other than Jesus Christ, who claims to come from beyond. And he suddenly finds himself utterly exposed. What is truth? In the middle of lockdown, I was going to, the statutory visit, or the allowed visit to the shops, and I metaphorically actually bumped into one of our neighbours who's very, very well read. And he said, "Oh, are you still doing talks at your church? And is it still open?" and all the rest of it. And I said, "Yeah, we're still." "And what are you speaking on this Sunday?" "I'm speaking on Pilate and his trial." He immediately said to me, "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. And I'm afraid that meant absolutely nothing to me, but it is a quote from Francis Bacon's essay on truth, written in 1610 or something like that. "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. And you see, here's the point. If Jesus' claim is correct, if he really has stepped in from outside, there is no hiding place. To fail to explore, or to claim that truth doesn't exist, or to wash our hands of truth as Pilate did, I mean, may I put it like this? It's at best an excuse. And I guess the reason Pilate is so frowned upon is, at worst, it's a failure of intellectual courage. Again, I hope you don't find this too trivial an example. One of my children was going to a school where they taught there's no such thing as truth in these matters, and everybody's truth was equally true. And she kept coming home with this sort of stuff. And one day the headmistress asked me to go in and do an assembly. And being the kind of guy I am, I'm afraid I couldn't resist the opportunity. So I went in and I said to all these 11-year-old girls who were pretty bright, I said to them, "I want you to imagine that I had a great Aunt Ethel." You can imagine great hilarity. I'm sorry if your name is Ethel, but there you are. They all thought this was hilarious. And then I said, "I want you to imagine that my great Aunt Ethel is..." Ask yourself the question, do you think my great Aunt Ethel is very, very tall? And kind of 25% of the hands went up. And do you think my great Aunt Ethel is very, very short? And 25% of the hands went up. And do you think my great Aunt Ethel is somewhere in the middle? And 25%. And there was remaining. Do you think my great Aunt Ethel doesn't even exist at all? And then some shrewd ones, their hands went up. And then I said, I want you to imagine for a moment that my great Aunt Ethel actually walked into the room. And here she is standing, and she's very, very tall. I mean, what would you say to the person who said, everybody's right? Now, the children were pretty bright. They started giggling. The teachers, I'm afraid, began to frown slightly, because this is absolute nonsense. And to say, well, actually, I'm not going to form an opinion on this, well, you would have to say it's at best, well, at worst, a failure of intellectual courage. And so the great claim is that Jesus brings to us truth from beyond. But I guess inevitably, if you're dealing with God, he shows us which side we're on. And our encouragement would be to say, look, won't you kind of come out into the open and look and explore the claims of Jesus Christ through the eyewitnesses. Here is Bacon's essay. I went home, as you can imagine. I tried to pretend that I had a rough idea of what he was talking about, but my cover was blown. It was a bit like interviewing Andrew, actually. And then as I rushed home and Googled Bacon's essay and read it, it's a very easy read. No pleasure is comparable to standing on the vantage ground of truth, a hill where the air is always clear and serene. Now, I got started as a Christian in 1979, quite a long time ago now. And I would, at the time, would have called myself Christian. I didn't realize that Christianity was about Christ, about Jesus. And I'd kind of been holding him at arm's length and never really embraced him. I had to spend a bit of time away from the boarding school that I was at for reasons that are none of your business. And so I went to stay with my grandfather, and he introduced me to the person of Jesus Christ. And I want to say, from a personal point of view, it has enhanced my own life in every way imaginable and brought greater depth and meaning to it all. And we would love you to explore the truth of Jesus for yourself. So, ways to do that. Well, as I mentioned, a guided read-through. You might ask somebody to read through the John's Gospel with you. You could pop in at the door there and talk to Abby and Tim about the Christianity Explored course. It runs for one evening a week over a 7-week period, and the person who brought you would love to bring you along. I'm sure it generally happens in here or one of our buildings. Not always quite the same sort of ambiance, but it's a lovely evening to explore the Christian faith and to read through one of the eyewitness accounts. But as we close, it's worth just leaving this thought with us. The claim that there is no such thing as truth is itself a truth claim. And I think one might say is fundamentally contradictory. And so I would encourage every one of us to look into this eyewitness material. I'd love you to do that.